Hello, HR of Tomorrow. Thanks so much for coming to my workshop, Dudes Do Better, Dismantling Toxic Masculinity at Work. My name is Jeff Harry with Rediscover Your Play. I live in the US in Oakland, California, and I am fascinated and excited to dive into this workshop with you today. So let's talk about what we're going to be covering. We're going to be delving into the impacts that toxic masculinity has had over the past 2 years, especially around the pandemic and the Great Resignation. We're going to address the myth of toxic masculine leadership. We're going to explore the balance of feminine and masculine leadership and find out how we can potentially foster that in leaders going forward. And finally, we are going to provide solutions for you, regardless of whether you're at the entry level, mid-level, or at the C-suite level. So my theory is that toxic masculine leadership drove the Great Resignation. You don't believe me? Let me prove it to you. Toxic masculine leadership traits are reflected by aspects like bullying, avoiding losing at all costs, restraining one's emotions, showing strength through aggression in moments of conflict, and exhibiting dominance, masking insecurity. So just take a look at those, and then let me just give you a brief story about what happened with the Great Resignation here in the US. So what happened at the beginning was there were a lot of companies, including Tesla, that forced their staff to go back to work even before a vaccine happened, even before a vaccine was even available. Some people died on the job and they still continued to force their staff to go back to work in the US. We had companies like John Deere and even Facebook starting strikes, unionizing, just to address some of the exploitation and the ways in which they felt used by their organization. We had other companies that received PPP loans that they were supposed to use for their staff, and instead they used that money to buy back stock, to reward investors, or to compensate their executives. And we even had airline companies that laid off tens of thousands of workers, only to a few months later wonder, where are all my staff? How come I can't find any staff to fly these planes, to do all these things? So they had to cancel flights. And then finally, we even had essential workers that were not only taken for granted, but sometimes exploited, and laws that were consistently broken by certain companies in how they laid off staff, how they treated staff. Overall, it was just a mess. And that resulted in so many people quitting. And when many companies stated, oh, the reasons are because of COVID or mental health, no, it was because they felt as if they were exploited. They felt used, they felt abused, they felt mistreated, and they felt expendable. These were the issues that were going on in the US. On top of that, in 2021, that's when we had 47.4 million people quit voluntarily. And that's a key term, voluntarily, meaning they could have stayed. They weren't laid off. The company was not in financial ruins. They just simply quit because they just had enough. And some of that Great Resignation also rolled over to Europe. As you can see, a third of UK workers were considering career changes in 2022. So this is an issue that we really need to address, but we have to get down to the core aspects of why this is happening. And one that I believe is toxic masculine leadership. So who am I? Why am I talking about this as a guy, as a man? Why would I be talking about this? Because it's our problem. We caused this mess. So we should clean it up. We've asked women to lean in. We've asked women to power pose. We've asked them to be assertive, but not too aggressive. We've asked them to do all these different things to adapt to our bad behavior to address this toxic masculine behavior by adapting or working around it, as opposed to us addressing it. And if us men don't address it, this is why it's called Dudes Do Better, we're not going to be able to solve these problems, and we're going to continue to have these issues that are really affecting our organizations and our bottom line. So who am I? My name is Jeff Harry, Rediscover Your Play. Before I did this, I actually wanted to play with toys for a living. I saw the movie Big when I was a kid with Tom Hanks. And as soon as I saw that movie in 3rd grade, I started writing toy companies immediately because I wanted to work for the toy industry. And I eventually got to work for the toy industry. And I don't know if you've ever gotten exactly what you've always wanted and then been so disappointed when you got there, but this is what it felt like. That's right. Cubicles for days, no fun, no toys, no high fives. But on top of that, a lot of toxic masculinity, especially at the leadership level, a lot of competition, a lot of bullying, a lot of individualism, everyone looking out for themselves instead of looking out for the team. And that just caused me to want to quit in my 20s, just like many Gen Zers are currently doing. So we have to really address why this continues to be the case and why we continue to tolerate this. So I left the toy industry and helped start an organization that became the largest Lego-inspired STEM organization in the US. And the way we did it was not through standard masculine leadership practices. You know, it wasn't about profitability. We focused on play. We had no business plan. We followed our intuition. We picked people that we thought were fun. We picked cities that we thought were fun. We never did analysis before we did it. We just tested it out. We just experimented. We prioritized relationships over short-term profits. We followed our curiosity, and we focused on inspiring our staff rather than commanding them or punishing them when they didn't achieve certain goals. And through that, we were extremely successful, to the point that we even got the attention of Facebook and Google and all these other organizations because we were doing so well. When I look back at this now that I'm running Rediscover Your Play, I realize that a lot of these traits are feminine leadership traits. A lot of them around collaboration and intuition and understanding that it's about the whole community and not just about the individual. So is this workshop anti-men? Whenever I'm running this, people are going to say, why are you anti-men? This seems like an anti-men workshop. No, we're talking about toxic masculine leadership. Anyone can exhibit toxic masculine leadership traits. Jeff Bezos, as well as Elizabeth Holmes, both exhibited a certain level of secrecy and internal competition. And that toxicity made it such an unenjoyable place for many people to work. So we should define what actually I mean when I talk about toxic masculinity. So toxic masculinity is a narrow and repressive description of manhood, designating being a man as defined by dominance, aggression, individualism, and lack of emotion. So what are some of the assumptions that we have to address from the toxic masculine leadership level? Because right now, the theory and the myth is that it produces higher profits. You need someone that's like a ball buster in order to get things done. Well, let's look at the data. The data doesn't lie. Companies with women in leadership positions, whether as directors or executive officers, considerably perform better. And this study is from 1997 through 2017. And then this other study from Statista found that even though there's only 15% of CEOs are women, they run 41 of the top Fortune 500 companies currently operating. The data's there, and we are not addressing it. We can make more money when we actually promote people that are focused on finding balance between both masculine and feminine leadership. The data doesn't lie. The reality is Toxic masculine leadership is not only not making you more profits, but it's costing companies billions. SHRM did a study back in September of 2019, before the pandemic, that found that $223 billion were being lost by Fortune 500 companies just in the last 5 years due to a toxic leader in their workforce. Even worse, Gallup found that active disengagement happens when you have a toxic boss, and that was costing US companies $450 to $550 billion a year. So these are real numbers. And if we want to get even micro on this, let's use one example, right? Let's say, for example, you're running a company in the US. How much does toxic masculine leadership cost a US company? How much does it cost? Let's say you have a toxic leader that brings in about $800,000 of revenue a year. Awesome. Great job, Chad. Waited it. But also, because they're so toxic, staff are quitting on a regular basis. So let's assume 3 staff out of the 5 have quit, and they were bringing in $250,000 of revenue apiece. There goes all that revenue that toxic leader just brought in. On top of that, now we have to train new staff. And now we have lost productivity as a team. As one study of researchers found that there's lost productivity of $14,000 per employee just having a toxic person around. And we have not even taken consideration a potential lawsuit that eventually might show up. And in the US, for a company to defend a lawsuit like that can be upwards of $250,000. And that's not about you winning or losing. That's just to defend. That's just to go to court. So what are we talking about? Per toxic masculine leader, it might cost you between $80,000 and $330,000. Those are the real numbers that are there. Now imagine if you have multiple toxic leaders. Just run the numbers and see you're hemorrhaging money because you continue to foster this type of leadership. So what do we want going forward? What does successful leadership look like? It looks like, for the future of work, or my proposal, is that it finds a balance between masculine leadership and feminine leadership. Yes, profitability is important, but so is sustainability. So how are we focused on that? Yes, we should use reason and logic a lot of the times to do a certain level of analysis, but we should also provide our staff the freedom to follow their intuition. Yes, sometimes it's good to have competition, but not always good internal competition. We should be focusing on collaboration and working as a team and focusing on the whole, focusing on the group rather than the individual. And we should be really not just driving home that we have to control everything, but instead are focused more on inspiring and coaching our staff to actually grow more. When you are able to tap into both of those and foster that in your leadership, the numbers don't lie. You are more successful, you are more profitable, and you're more likely to keep a majority of your staff. So who are examples of this balanced form of leadership? So let's head on over to New Zealand, where we have New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. And she said, one of the criticisms I've faced over the years is that I am not aggressive enough or assertive enough, or maybe somehow because I'm empathetic, I'm weak. I totally rebel against that. I refuse to believe that you cannot be compassionate and strong. By her actually being compassionate and strong, New Zealand had the lowest COVID rates of any country in the world. It also had the lowest COVID deaths of any country in the world. This is the type of leadership that happens, and these are the results when you can find that balance between masculine and feminine leadership. On the other side of the pond, in Seattle, Washington, there's a guy by the name of Dan Price that runs an organization called Gravity Payments, who became famous by setting a minimum wage of $70,000 a year for each of his staff. That is the lowest he would pay each of his staff members. Well, what did he find? Since my company started $70K minimum wage in 2015, staff having kids soared 10 times. Virtually no companies followed suit. Look at what he is valuing. Look how he's focused as the whole instead of focusing on the individual. And then what happened to gravity payments during the pandemic? Didn't have to lay off one staffer. Why? Because a majority of the staff were willing to take pay cuts so that no one had to be laid off. Why did they do that? Because they know that Dan Price and the gravity payments leadership had their back in 2015 and so forth, and they were willing to come back and also have their back. This is fostering a shared humanity way approach to leadership. Shared compassion, shared humanity, shared empathy. These are the ways in which we can move towards a future of work where people actually enjoy work and are more willing to stay. So where do we begin? We need to first address the various power dynamics, because I recognize that there are power dynamics and not everyone has the same level of power, but we still can address this and we still have agency regardless of what level you're at. So if we're talking for the entry and junior level staff, my recommendation, if you want to dismantle toxic masculinity, is first we need to find allies and employees who have similar issues. We need to start gathering those stories, finding those patterns, and really finding a community that does not want to tolerate this type of leadership anymore in your organization. Then we need to start gathering data as you're talking to these allies and finding employees that have similar issues. You're going to start to see some patterns and start gathering data on, like, what teams are losing a lot of staff? What is the reason? Who is the toxic leader that is causing a lot of these issues? The more you start gathering these stories as well as data and how much this is actually costing the organization, you can start to compile that, as opposed to just complaining and being like, well, I feel this way. Instead, focusing on the data and being like, this is the impact that this is actually having. And then you can take that and give that to your leadership, or give that to HR or other leaders, so that we can start to address this. And the other thing that entry level need to remember is that you have more leverage than you could ever have in the history of work because of this great resignation. There's so many more options out there. So utilize that leverage, utilize that agency, understand the power and the value you have towards the organization by staying. Because remember, they're going to have to retrain someone else if you leave, and really start to address these issues and be like, look, I want to stay, but we got to address this. We got to figure out a new way of actually leading, or address, either eradicate some of the toxic masculine leadership that is here, or start putting them on a performance improvement plan. Mid-level management. I know you get crapped on at the top and then you got complaints from the bottom. It is a very difficult position to be in, but you still have agency, you still have power. So I would first recommend that you investigate why staff have left. What are their reasons for leaving? Look back at those exit interviews. If you can talk to former staff, even better. Then start talking to your staff that you currently lead and ask them, did the company gain your trust or lose your trust during the pandemic? And if you are not comfortable having that conversation yet, then you have to start building trust back with your staff, start spending more time talking to them, finding out what issues are going on in their life, so that you can have that conversation, because that's the only way in which we're going to be able to address these issues. You need to start having more difficult and challenging conversations with your staff and understanding what are the roadblocks that are getting in their way, and what's the likelihood they might leave and why. Then you need to also then focus on your circle of influence. So yes, maybe part of the leadership is toxic. Maybe some of the other departments are toxic, but that doesn't mean your team has to be. That doesn't mean you can't lead from a different standpoint. And when you start to think about that, you can actually collaborate with your staff and be like, all right, let's figure out new ways in which you want me to lead. How do we want to experiment with this? How do we make this much more collaborative? How do we allow you to play more or follow your intuition so that you can actually do the best work? How do you do more of the work that makes you come alive so that we get the most out of you and you are happiest being at this job? These are the questions that mid-level management can explore and can address with their staff. And then finally, at the executive and C-suite level, we need to first address what is the worst behavior you are currently tolerating? Who is running amok right now? Who is causing havoc and getting people to quit or getting people to just disengage at meetings? You know who they are. And if you don't, you need to just simply ask your mid-level management and your entry-level staff, and they will tell you who is causing havoc. And you need to address that, whether that is firing that individual, putting them on a performance improvement plan, or addressing it directly. Because right now, by allowing that behavior to run amok, you are giving permission for everyone else to act that way as well. And that's not what you want, because it's affecting your bottom line. Then you really have to reassess, what metrics are you using? Are you measuring success by? Are we still just focused on quarterly profits? Are we also focused on employee retention, especially when we have a revolving door of staff leaving? It doesn't matter how much money you make if you're losing staff and losing money on the other end. So we really have to reassess, what metrics do we consider success going forward? And then actually create new ways in which to evaluate our staff. And then we have to start funding our committees and our employee resource groups, or our ERGs. These are groups that gather together. They're like affinity groups, whether they're people that want to focus more on DEI, people that want to promote or have more women in leadership roles. We need to be funding these small groups that provide a safe space for staff to be heard, seen, and appreciated. And that is another way in which you can actually help to retain employees, and you're putting your money where your mouth is. That's really crucial. And then lastly, we need as a society to stop celebrating toxic masculine leaders, especially in mainstream media. Right now, there are 3 series out that celebrate or deify the guy from WeWork, Elizabeth Holmes from The Dropout, and then even the toxic CEO at Uber. Why? Yes, it is a ridiculous story, but why is it always being promoted? I put Wolf of Wall Street on here because when I speak to many finance, staff or finance directors, they love this movie. They want to be just like this guy, even though they know that guy went to jail, even though they know that guy treated his staff horribly. This is the problem, is as long as we continue to celebrate and deify these toxic masculine leaders, we're going to cultivate more of them. And we're just going to have this revolving door of issues. So right now, we really are at a crossroads to determine the future of work. Are we focused on a pre-pandemic leadership that's driven by individualism, that's driven by power and bullying, that's driven by this lack of focus on the community or the company as a whole and looking out for staff? Or are we now focused on post-pandemic leadership that's driven by compassion, empathy, collaboration, understanding, intuition? This is the choice we have. This is the choice you have in your role each and every day, and you have to decide how you want to do this going forward. Because if we don't dismantle toxic masculinity at work, we are going to continue to extend this great resignation as well as other issues in the workplace. Thank you so much for attending this workshop. I will now take questions. One last thing, I put here my this website. I'm writing an article that's actually coming out in the next couple of days about this specific topic, reviewing much of the stuff I just spoke about, but in more detail. And if you want to go to that website right there, you can, I can send you a link to that article when it comes out. And now we'll take some questions.